Greetings, I'm Captain Kevin Smith. I want to talk a little bit more about the velocity spectrum. And the reason for that is I think it tends to be overlooked in terms of its importance. I would put velocity at the very top of the performance hierarchy. Let me frame it this way. We are now back into what is called, or what I call, Cold War version 2. I was involved in Cold War version 1, which is described as the Great Power Conflict. Cold War version 2 puts us back at the high end of the conflict spectrum. The high end of the conflict spectrum means, among other things, that we will be facing an enemy on the battlefield that has similar, equal, or greater capabilities from a military standpoint than what we have and then what we can deliver to the battle space. What do we want to talk about in terms of the velocity spectrum? The spectrum goes from zero velocity, in other words, stationary, all the way up to speeds that match or exceed the speed of sound. That happens to be the sonic era, or what we call supersonic. If we are engaged in combat at the high end of the conflict spectrum, we will be engaged in high velocity aerial combat. If we're looking at the airborne battle space, high velocity aerial combat means just that. The velocities are very high. They could be close to, they could match, or they could exceed the speed of sound. Now, that's one demarcation line on the velocity spectrum, but it's not the only one. I'm going to point out a couple of others that are important to know, but little understood. The first one is what I call the forward propagation number. What does that mean? That means that if the object, in this case an airplane, which produces noise, is traveling at a certain high velocity, an observer, a stationary observer on the ground, will not hear the noise being generated before the object passes over. That's called the forward propagation number. That velocity has been identified experimentally, or from a practical standpoint. We know what that velocity is now because we have experimented and we have used it in combat, so we know. That number is 450 knots. Now, let me just stop for a second here and explain that. A nautical mile is 6,000 feet. A statute mile is 5,280. In aviation, we deal with nautical miles. So a knot is a nautical mile per hour. 450 knots is the forward propagation number. That's particularly important from a tactical standpoint, because if the enemy is stationary, before you reach the target, the enemy cannot hear you coming. The next one is what we call the atmospheric compression number. That happens to be the point at which we achieve supersonic flight. A supersonic means that you're traveling faster than the speed of sound. Now, when you get to that point where you have matched the speed of sound, the air compresses and it disturbs the airflow over the wings of the airplane and the fuselage of the airplane, and produces all kinds of control difficulties. And the airplane has to be specifically designed to be able to transition through the atmospheric compression number as smoothly as possible. It's not always totally smooth. The supersonic airplanes that I have flown, which includes the F-11 Tiger, which is the world's first supersonic airplane, as well as the F-A Crusader, which at one time was the world's fastest airplane. Those two airplanes transitioned pretty well through the atmospheric compression zone, which is identified by the atmospheric compression number. That happens to be Mach 1.0. So the sonic velocity number is the Mach number. In modern air combat, in the fighter pilot community as well, we think of speeds in terms of Mach numbers. So a Mach number less than 1 or less than supersonic would be point something or other, like a 0.9. And we just call it Mach 0.9, Mach 0.8. Those numbers, the Mach number, if you say, what is your speed? My speed is Mach 0.8. That happens to be 8 miles per minute as well. The sonic velocity number is a Mach number. The compression number is Mach 1.0. There is also another number, which is what I call the drag energy conversion number. So at some speed, which is represented by the maximum velocity of this particular airplane, what is the maximum level velocity of this particular airplane? That's what I call the drag energy conversion number. That's where the drag equals the energy. They converge at that point, and the airplane cannot go any faster in level flight. That level flight number is particularly important in terms of looking at the performance characteristics of not only your airplane or friendly airplanes in the airborne battle space, but also looking at the performance capabilities of the enemy. The enemy has airplanes that can go supersonic. They have a number of prototype airplanes right now, if we're talking about China, that are 6th generation fighters, and these airplanes are all Mach 2 plus capable airplanes. The drag energy conversion number is pretty high. We have had some airplanes in our inventory. For example, the F-106. I just finished a Substack article on the F-106 Delta Dart. That airplane, single engine fighter interceptor airplane that used to be flown by the U.S. Air Force. They should still bring it back and start flying it again, in my view. The drag energy conversion number, or we could also call it the level flight maximum velocity for the F-106, was a little bit better than Mach 2.4. That's a pretty remarkable number. The airplane that I flew, the F-A Crusader, the drag energy conversion number of that airplane. Now, keep in mind that there was a number of versions of that airplane over its long career with the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Marine Corps, and also with the French Air Force. That drag conversion number was just about Mach 1.9, so it was pretty close to Mach 2. If we put some of the later engines and some of the earlier models that were lighter, it probably could exceed or at least achieve Mach 2. So it was in a Mach 2 version airplane. Drag conversion numbers of other airplanes currently in our inventory, if we're looking at the FA-18 Super Hornet for the Navy and the F-35 for the Navy and the Air Force, those airplanes max out at Mach 1.6. 1.6 is inadequate number. It's an inadequate number for a great power conflict. We should be much higher up on the velocity spectrum if we expect to win in the airborne battle space environment. The last number I want to talk about is the number that in which increased time compression occurs. Now that's a phenomena that moves us into a new reality at some point on the velocity spectrum. And I'm going to identify that in a moment, but I want to get this idea across so it's clear. At some point on the velocity spectrum, increased time compression occurs. Time compression means that the time available to do something is less than the time required. Okay, so if you say that it takes me 5 seconds or 10 seconds or 20 seconds to do something, it could be to manipulate the radar, it could be to change trajectories, it could be to execute a maneuver, it could be to recognize a new threat, it could be to perform a offensive or defensive maneuver. It could also be to follow a particular procedure to extinguish a engine fire. We saw the engine fire scenario in the Top Gun 2 movie. That was clearly identified in that movie. The pilot happened to be Phoenix, and she was going through the procedures to extinguish the engine fire and to reconfigure the airplane for single engine operation. That all takes a certain amount of time to do that. If you are in an environment in which increased time compression is the reality, the time available is so short that it doesn't match the time required to do it. So let's say, for an example, that in order to extinguish the engine fire and to reconfigure the airplane for single engine operations, we can do the timing in a simulator, by the way. It takes 10 seconds, let's say. The time when you're traveling at high velocities, that time available is compressed. And so if the requirement is 10 seconds, but you only have 5 seconds available because the time has been compressed, then you need to adapt and you need to adjust for that new reality. Now, what does that mean? It means that you have to miss or drop certain steps. You have to modify certain things that you are doing. Also, if you are engaged in maneuvering the airplane, you have to be able to maneuver the airplane more effectively now, because you don't have time to make a number of corrections. The number of corrections that are necessary in order to execute the maneuver have been reduced. Let's say, for example, you were executing a high yo-yo maneuver, because that happens to be an offensive maneuver when you are engaged in air combat, and the execution of that maneuver takes 12 seconds, but you are in a time compressed environment in which the velocities are exceedingly high, then you only have 8 seconds instead of 12 to complete the maneuver. And so you have to be able to execute the maneuver much more effectively during that period of time. So the combat effectiveness of the operator has to be elevated so that you can deal with the realities of time compression. Time compression represents a new reality. It's a new reality that humans have never encountered before. We didn't even know it existed, but it does. And the wonderful scenes in the Top Gun 1 movie about the bird strike, about the engine fire, about the flame outs and the ejection sequence, that all points out there's something going on here that really stresses the man-machine system to the breaking point. At some point in time, you noticed in that movie that they did point out, and we try to avoid mistakes, but mistakes are going to happen. It's called threat and error management. It's kind of a technical term that we use now in aviation. I do not remember the name of the individual that first came up with that idea, but I did work with him on a project that I was involved with dealing with pilot training. I wish I knew his name, but I don't at the present time. But a single person came up with threat and error management, which was a remarkable advancement in our understanding. Now, if we are going to manage threats and errors, if we're going to do error management, we have to be able to do it within the time available, and the time available is very, very short. And that short period of time is what we are calling the new reality. The new reality has raised its head because of this phenomena that we call increased time compression. Finally, I just want to say, and I've said this before, just to repeat, that time compression or increased time compression means that the time available to do something, to perform some activity, it could be a mental, physical, or both activity within the context of the mission, the time available is less than the time required, and therefore adjustments to the activity have to be made so that you can, or we can, effectively complete the activity consistent with the time available to do it, right? So there has to be that adjustments and the flexibility. Another term that's also used is agility. We have to be agile. We have to be agile enough to make those adjustments on the fly, to make those adjustments in real time so that we can actually succeed in the mission. Thank you for watching, and we will see you again soon.